I suppose inevitably you learnt on the job here at Rutherglen as well, but I think you went
No,
through
not here.
Roseworthy, didn't you?
Yeah, I went to Roseworthy, and I just Stanley was the first job I had after Roseworthy, and we went round and had a look at quite a lot of the other places in South Australia, in the Barossa and south of Adelaide, and even Stanley. That was about one of the last places we looked at.
Okay, and how about red wine at Stanley?
Oh, the only cooling they had was well water when I was there, and that was about 15 degrees, so you couldn't get it down very much. But I used to stop up all night pumping the water up into the tank and using it up through pipes on top of the skins. Or in Riesling, I'm not too sure how we looked at that. Bury and Sable's at Watervale, they just put them into about 3/4 full casks and put a pipe in the top of it, and then the pipe went into a 4-gallon bucket of sulphur souse, and when it went, it just roared, and there was no temperature control. But nothing went out though. That was all. The big problem, when I started off with the temperature control, we didn't have much. I think Orlando just bought some tanks, and Yalumba had cooling, and the only other place that I knew had cooling was Hamilton's. And they fermented in casks. Remember running across to play football in my socks, finally I stood on there was a patch of jacks on the way over, and so I had to sit on them and put my boots on them and dusted the 3-corner jacks off. But well, we weren't used to prickles here in those days. The kids used to take their shoes off from here and walk to school barefoot, and they were barefoot at school, and they put their shoes on just before they came home. Carried them and then put them on when they walked down the drive. The Lake School was about a mile up the road.
So you went to the Lake School too?
No,
you didn't?
No,
okay.
I went to Rutherglen School for a little while.
Okay.
Only for about a year, or I think my mother wanted to get rid of us, but she had kept on having babies. And so the older ones, if you can get them to school, somebody would look after them and harness the energy.
Right, so you said you went to Rutherglen for only a year?
Year or two, I'm not too sure. My brother went with me, and now whether he came halfway with me, he was a bit too young. He was 18 months younger than I was, and he was a wee bit too young to go to school.
Was that Peter or
no, Ken?
That's Ken.
Yeah, he died burnt in a room. He joined the Navy, and they went in at 13 in those days. Well, that's how they trained them, ship's boys, and but they were educated by the Navy at Flinders Naval Depot, and they call it the Royal Australian Naval College. And I used to play rugby against them. I went to a school in Hawthorn in Melbourne.
How have you seen Rutherglen change, both, if you have, either the town or the wines in your time here?
I think it's got to change a bit more still. However, I think George Smith probably was the one that was old George reckoned that he couldn't make any whites at Rutherglen. Young George, with no equipment at all to make wines, he managed to get a cooler eventually, but he got a silver medal in Adelaide with the Shastless and Marsan and Shastless, all the judges thought we'd made a terrible blue, giving George a silver medal. We wondered what had happened. Anyway, he made one of the first whites that was very good. Morris has always made whites. They made whites out of Barnawatha Pedro, I think, which was, or Barnawatha something or other, which they actually turned out to be Semillon, I think. But yeah, they made whites and reds and sold them in bottles. We had Seppelts and Lindemans here. They more or less, Lindemans, well, both Seppelts and Lindemans made sherry material and fortifieds, ports and muscat and probably muscadel, Tokay now. Or Topake rather. Yes. It's a peculiar name, isn't it? I think they got talked into it. Topake. Anyway, Chris is banding the name Topake around. I called it muscadel early on, and I haven't changed. I'm putting Topake underneath muscadel, but I much prefer muscadel. At least it's the name of a grape.
Yeah. And the town itself.
Oh, the town itself sort of went down a bit at one stage, and many of the shops in the main street were empty, but it came back again, but it's still sort of hovering. I think probably from the tourist angle, I think having a bookshop in is a wonderful second-hand bookshop's a wonderful acquisition, and we've had some very good restaurateurs, which have been very good for the town, but they don't last. They keep going for a while, and then you've got to wait for another batch to turn up. But I think most of the people in Rutherglen are quite happy as it is, except that they moan about having a main road going through the main street. That could be easily rectified by just taking all the cars out of the main street and putting them on the side streets, and people would have to walk another, 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 yards to metres to shop. That would make it much safer in the main street, because when it's full of cars on both sides from one end to the other, as it is sometimes now, it's a bit dangerous when two trucks come down. Or even two cars, because people are a bit inclined to open their doors.
And have the wines changed in your time?
Well, most of us have got cooling now, some form of refrigeration, which has made a big difference to the wines. But I still think we've got to get. I'm possibly using old casks and Brettanomyces. Until Brettanomyces turned up, I didn't know why Australian wines didn't go on. They produced beautiful young wines, and then they got almost an H2S pong as they got older. And they all had it, and I just wondered what had happened. If you put enough wood into it, you could disguise it, and that Brett character. But you need to put an awful lot of wood, and if you use new wood, hopefully you didn't get as much Brett as people that used old casks for years.
And the styles of red wine?
Well, I think it's still much the same. We're still making full-bodied reds. I'd like it to go away from it a little bit, get it down a little bit, but that means picking earlier and not going about 13.5 BAME. I like about 13.5% alcohol. I find 14.5% alcohol or 15% alcohol, I find it hard to drink them after a while. You have a couple of glasses, then you suddenly say, hell, this is too alcoholic.
Now, of course, you're just as well known, or were just as well known as a wine judge particularly your chairing of various shows like Melbourne and so on. How did you get involved in that?
They had what they call, all the shows had stewards or associate judges their job was really to take the glasses away from the judges and fill them up with wine so the judges didn't see the wines or didn't handle them. I started off in South Australia. It was very interesting. We started off with Riesling classes, and of course Semillon was Hunter River Riesling, so that was accepted as Riesling. So you had the funny situation when Orlando had just started to make Barossa Riesling in stainless steel with temperature control and all that sort of thing, and they were beautiful wines. And obviously Riesling, and I think the first two wines in the first and second were both Semillons from the Hunter. Years later, Carl Seville said, I was judging in Adelaide, and he said, well, you did a good job this year. The Hunter didn't get any Guernseys.
So that was your first...
Yeah, that was in Adelaide. Then I came back here, and I was asked to judge as an associate in Melbourne, and I think probably I was mostly put with various ones. Johnny Stanford became a judge in Adelaide because Doug Seabrook didn't turn up, so John was made a judge from being an associate, and he was judging these Rieslings and Semillons, and he suggested to Roy Smith, who was the Melbourne judge, that perhaps in a Riesling, in a Hock class, they call them Hocks, I think. In a Hock class, perhaps it'd be good if a Riesling did win. And George Fairbrother said, "Don't worry, John, I'll win next year." Anyway, Dick Buller, I spent a lot of time with Dick Buller and Bryce Frank, and Bryce was very good because he knew what all these stinks and stenches were, and that was good. Up till then we didn't know, and he'd tell us what they were, and it was very, very interesting. And so eventually, after a while, I got a Guernsey in Melbourne, and then they tossed me out because they said there were too many Rutherglen judges. Would bias the thing, so I missed out on 1 year, and somebody, one of the council came down. I didn't know him very well, from Yarrawonga, came down and said, "Well, you've got some pretty good muskets and tokais, why don't you put them in?" So I put some in, and I was lucky enough to get some Guernseys that year, and then they asked me back. George Smith used to judge too for a while. Yeah.
And so, obviously, eventually you work through the ranks. And
well, eventually, yeah. Well, it's. I don't know how these things work. You just get I suppose they put you in, and anyway, I took the idea that I had more or less had to try to help the committee. It was a help job, not my own, not push myself at all. And it seemed to work. They kept me on for a long while.
Mm. Yes, you were chair in Melbourne for...
20 years or so. A good 20 years. 1980 to sometime in 2001 or 2002 I was relieved of the job.
Okay, and the local show?
I was for a while, but that was I just looked on it as a part-time thing, and I had to sort of fit it in with my work. So I didn't dress up in a suit to come to the local, so if it was wet I came in gumboots, but it was, I don't think I was ever, I was just judged there. There was no senior judge. Oh, okay. There were about 3 judges, and the idea was that they'd work it out. Mick Morris and Doug Jones used to steward there for a long while, and Ron Prince, George Graham, and Dick Buller were the judges, and I remember one stage they were discussing the wines. Ron Prince and Dick and George Graham were discussing the wines, and then finally at the end of it, they mentioned, they came to a decision. And I remember Dick saying, "Well, you got it right this time, boys."
Who are some of the other characters you remember in the industry then?
Oh, well, there were quite a lot of them. They were just old winemakers. There was George Fairbrother he used to conduct the exams at Roseworthy, tasting exams, and there was only one just at the last year where you had a tasting exam. And he told me later on that he worked for Anella as a winemaker from Roseworthy, and he was in the Depression, and he was taken off winemaking and sent to Sydney to collect the bills in the Depression, because they were selling a lot of wine, but they weren't getting paid much. They had to get the money. And so they were going to send him overseas and all this sort of thing, but it didn't ever eventuate. And eventually he ended up selling corks. There were quite a few others. Rudy Kromberger, John Fornish, and it just goes on the list. John was a very retiring fella, and one of the judges didn't turn up one morning, and only two judges judging. The idea with three that you didn't need if you put three, mostly they had two judges, and then you had a chairman judge. And then they decided to put three judges in, and they reckoned that you wouldn't need a chairman judge then, because 2 out of 3 should win, but every now and then you still get arguments. Everybody goes off on the same, particularly if you don't talk. They used to talk and cull early on when I started, and then that was cut out. We thought that if you talk too much, eventually you knew what everybody liked. the other fellas liked. They didn't actually say it, but you learned the wines they liked. Rudy Kromberger used to say, "And what do you think of number 4?" And if you say, "Oh, number 4 is pretty good, but have a look at number 9." And if you didn't do that, I tested him out. I didn't ask him about number 9. I tell you what, I couldn't get number 9 up. He'd made up his mind, but that he hadn't seen it, and that was it. So it was very interesting judging with these blokes.
Well, what do you think your contribution to Rutherglen's been?
I suppose I was trained as a winemaker, as Dick Buller was. Dick and George, sort of. George Smith did the course there, but because he'd done, he did it in a year with Bailey Carrodus, and because George hadn't done science, he didn't get any credit for it, but at least he'd done the course. And Mick Morris did it in a year. He'd done a science course. He and Ron Potter went through together. Otherwise, it was 2 years agriculture and 2 years winemaking, or getting blisters on your fingers from burettes and that sort of thing. And probably not enough microscopic work when I was there. I found out that you read about gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, but when you come to stain them, it doesn't always come out as the book says. I think that was the weakness when I was there, that we didn't spend enough. We spent all our time on analytical chemistry, when we should have spent a lot more time on microbiology.
And what do you think you've brought?
What did I bring?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know whether I brought much at all. I managed to make wine, and we were able to sell it. That helped a bit. We didn't, and eventually made enough money to buy some refrigeration. Colin Campbell bought some milk coolers when he came back from Roseworthy. I got John Brown's first cooler, which was some rings, and they filled it up with ice, and we were able to control the temperatures pretty well then. But up till then, nobody much around Rutherglen had anything. Colin was the first one to use an old ice. One of the old milk coolers anyway, and so we all had milk coolers after that, and then Colin eventually bought himself a U-Butte thing, and it was a matter of making enough money to get the equipment that we needed in. That was the problem. We knew what we needed, but I suppose most of my contribution was as a judge that I'd picked up from the other judges. There's a lot of argument about wine shows, but the idea was, when we first started, was speed the plough. Try not to make volatile wines. And try not to make oxidised and volatility. Vinegar and oxidation were the big problems. Oh, and H2S, that was another one too. But
And what are your hopes for Rutherglen in the future?
I think we've got to become. I suppose we've just got to make better wines, because we're not.
And what do you think of the wines that will maintain Rutherglen's success or take it further?
Well, we're making some nice reds. Some of us are. If you get an odd silver and open company, you're starting, and one or two of us are getting an odd one. Not enough yet, but I think we've got to. I suppose it's all cleanliness, really, Viv Thompson was having problems with wine. Then Trevor Marsh came in, who was trained in Germany, and the first thing Trevor did was said, well, we won't use all your old cask for table wines. That's the first thing, and we'll buy some new wood. And that took away the Brett that he had. As it turned out, we didn't know it was Brett then, but he started to make cleaner wines, and that turned him around. And he did very well in the show, which is a great. Well, you have to blame Trevor for it, and the other winemakers, because Viv hasn't actually. He's looked after the vineyards and done the best he can, but he's had other people to make the wine for him, and he's done very well that way, which is a big credit to him to know and do it that way, because he's made some beautiful wines.
And so
I think Rutherglen's the same way. We've got to get rid of our old casks and use them for fortifieds if we need to. There's still a demand for fortifieds. I don't think they'll ever go out completely, because the wine, they're so good. Muscats and Tokos, they've just got so much flavour and they're so beautiful. Vintage ports, we can make some good vintage ports too if we've got the right varieties. Chris Colleen became very good, and he started to do very well with the ports and muscats, and once again, Jack didn't have enough money to make the sweet muscats and Tokos that Morris's and probably Chambers were making. My grandfather didn't have much wine experience. I think he picked it all up from probably Rouge, who came from Prussia. Or at least I imagine that's where it came from. He had a very good palate, and George Smith got a Roseworthy bloke in because it's what's his name? David Smith, George's grandfather, DB they called him, wouldn't use sulphur dioxide. All Saints will not use sulphur dioxide, so he had a hell of a lot of volatile wines in the cellar, and they were stubborn. And one of the blokes was leaning against some straight-sided casks outside on the sand, and he knocked on one, and he noticed the white ants had got into it. And he said, "Mr. Smith, I'd like to talk to you." I said, "About one of your casks." "Oh," he said, Mr. Smith said, "Duskull, you look after your business and All Saints will look after theirs." And he said they lost 3 of them, or 2 of them, before he'd do something about it. He was just so stubborn. Well, I suppose we're all a bit stubborn sometimes. But I think that's about the equipment. We've all got better equipment, stainless steel and cooling, adequate cooling, and probably filtration's coming into it now too. If you can get your reds filtered and get them clear of lees and anything, get them almost bright straight away, you're going to make a much better red. I think that's down to filtration. A lot of people don't like it, and in Europe particularly, I noticed they were still sticking to isinglass and that sort of thing to get it down. They thought that was more winemaking than filtering it. But I think the Germans are so good at filtration that, and the Italians too, with these membranes. Whether the Barossa is much the same as Rutherglen, except that they've always been able to make cleaner wine. I think for over the years, Seppelton Lindemann's kept up with it, with old casks, and they kept up while they were doing. I suppose Ray Kidd was the first Roseworthy guy they had in there. Oh no, it wasn't. It was Leo Buring.
Yes,
Leo Buring was the first Roseworthy guy that went in there.
Okay, well,
that's about it.
I think we're just about done. So thank you very much for coming in and talking.
Yeah, that's it.